Hi, this is Micah Clark, the director of the American Family Association of Indiana. With me today is a local Indiana author and activist, David Lantz. He's also an education professor. And we've talked to David before about some of the books he's written. One in particular has played a big role and run coincidingly as some efforts that we've worked on in the legislature regarding civics education in Indiana. And that's what we wanted to talk to David about a little bit today regarding his book called The Unraveling of We the People. David, in our last interview, we ended talking about the need for civics education being based on moral values that are informed by faith in God that were common back years ago, that we all kind of embraced. To get that started, can you explain what that is?
Sure. Well, just to kind of help us think through that a little bit, if perhaps some of your listeners, especially if they're homeschoolers, are familiar with something called the McGuffey Eclectic Reader. That was available beginning about the year 1836 up until roughly the 1940s. And there's a guy who wrote a book called, his name was John Westerhoff III. He wrote a book called McGuffey and His Readers. And in the book, McGuffey, or the guy talked about how McGuffey portrayed God as creator, preserver, and governor. And so throughout those stories that children would have read growing up, they got stories on moral character education, many of the stories coming out of the Bible. Well, a few years back, there is a researcher by the name of Lincoln Mullen who works with the George Washington University, who began to get very interested in the fact that he saw this Bible verse that kept popping up. It was from 1 Samuel 3:4, and it kept popping up in the year 1876 in newspapers across the United States. So he did a little bit of research. The verse itself, for those that don't know, says, Then the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, Here I am. Well, it turns out that 1876 was an election between Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, and Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Samuel Tilden actually won the popular vote, and he used that Bible verse sort of like we would use a bumper sticker today. And so this researcher, Lincoln Mullen, discovered that, while we had the McGuffey Reader for children, the newspapers of America published Bible verses. They took sermons of prominent pastors in the local communities and republished their sermons. And they also even had crossword puzzles based on the Bible. And so the society was steeped in an understanding of the scriptures. And so even Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, says that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And in 1954, a pastor by the name of George Doherty, when he was working on giving a sermon in the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., where Lincoln attended when he was president. And in fact, Dwight Eisenhower happened to sit in the Lincoln pew. And that morning, he was giving a sermon on Lincoln's birthday. And he decided to focus on the words under God in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And he said, to omit the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance is to omit the definitive character of the American way of life. Within 3 months, the Congress of the United States had changed the Pledge of Allegiance to put those words into the pledge. Much of Doherty's sermon had to do with that. And so that's a backdrop to some of the things that were going on in our culture and how we in America, in terms of character education, moral values, we're very familiar with the words of the Bible.
David, as you talk, it reminds me about 20 years ago, there was a very popular book that you're familiar with that former education secretary under President Reagan used, and it was a very popular book called The Book of Virtues. Mm-hmm. And I think Dr. Bennett also maybe saw some of the changes that we were losing in character education. That's why he put out, I think, 2 volumes of that book. One was tan and one was blue. Mm-hmm. And it was for use of kids to learn stories. Some were from the Bible, some were just poems, some were stories that had kind of been lost in our textbooks that taught moral virtue. Is that kind of what, I mean, obviously Dr. Bennett saw something changing 20 years ago. What do you think has changed in civics education?
Well, a lot of things have happened. Essentially, what's changed is that we really have gotten rid of the idea of moral values, and it kind of goes back to this effort by a guy by the name of Horseman. In fact, there are schools across America that are named for Horseman. Horseman comes along in the 1850s, and he starts to offer a more professionalized version of teaching. And he uses the what's referred to as the Prussian model. Prussia is now the modern country of Germany, but in those days it was called Prussia. And so they had a very rigid form of drill and kill instruction, if I might use that. And some people have talked about the idea of factory schools that train kids up to work in a factory and to do essentially what the government wants them to do. And so that comes along and competes with the grassroots from the bottom up type of teaching that was under the McGuffey readers. What Horace Mann wanted to do was introduce mandatory education where you would have government run schools and the kids would go there. So these things are mixing along. And by the late 1890s, a guy by John Dewey comes along. He doesn't like the factory schools. He doesn't like the McGuffey readers either. What he wants to do is he wants to get rid of teaching history because he sees no point in it. He wants to get rid of character education based on the Bible. And instead, he wants to treat the children as like tabula rasa. We're going to let them develop their own moral values. And so we'll just have them do things, learning by doing. And I don't mean to disparage learning by doing. A lot of things you can't learn to do until you actually do them yourself. But he wanted to focus so much on that and get rid of reading and things of that nature. And it was John Dewey, through what came to be known as the progressive movement, that wanted to dismiss the teaching of history and virtuous character, get Christianity out of the public schools, leave, and as a consequence, moral education, character education began to suffer. And because at this point in time in American history, the Bolshevik Revolution had launched the Soviet Union and Russia, and several of the contemporaries of Dewey fell in love with the Soviet system of doing things. They basically wanted to marry into that whole teaching of education. And so the long and the short of it is that by the time you get into some of the Supreme Court decisions that began to declare that we have to have this wall of separation between church and state, that we began to move the Bible out. And one last comment before I shut up on this topic. 1962 was the year that we had a court case known as Engel versus Vitale. That's the court case that took prayer out of school. One of the things that I do is I teach graduate and undergraduate college courses. And in one of the graduate courses I teach, one of the issues that comes up is business ethics. And I did some research on this, and I discovered that in 1974 was the first year that business schools began to introduce ethics education in schools of business. Now, if you think about it, 1974 minus 1962 is 12 years. So after the 12 years, K through 12, after 12 years of no more prayer in school, that's when people in colleges began to realize, gee whiz, we better start teaching ethics.
Well, it's interesting. The people you mentioned, Dewey and Mann, are often mentioned as humanists. And is a humanism what I mean? Nature doesn't like a vacuum. So if you take something out, something else comes in. And I've often heard those two as described as humanists or secularists. So what replaced character education based on general moral Judeo-Christian values?
If I remember correctly, I think I'm 15 to 20 years older than you. So Micah, did you ever have a series of readers, basically C-Spot Run and Jack and Jane went up the hill? And so we began to replace the McGuffey readers and other things with the most boring types of stories you can possibly imagine. And part of that came from the development of a book by a guy by the name of Joseph Fletcher. He wrote a book called Situational Ethics in 1966. And basically, we're going to get rid of the concept of sin. And it's simply that everybody has their own lifestyle choices. And so, is it right? Is it wrong? Well, it depends on the situation. And so that's one of the things that began to come along. And a guy by the name of Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind. His name was Alan Bloom. And what he talked about, and he did that in 1987, is he began to see that you began to have this generation of kids, frankly, my generation, to be blunt about it, I'm a baby boomer, that were growing up without any understanding of the classics, without any understanding of Western civilization history, without any firm moral underpinnings of right versus wrong. And he saw this sort of thing as character education giving way to what we now call value relativism. And so we can then see that this virtue that we have in our society is unraveling as these humanist sorts of people wanted to remove Christianity and in fact say, well, character education must not be that important. We'll just let the kids figure it out. And if you've ever put a bunch of 5-year-olds together in a room, watch out.
I remember in Alan Bloom's book, there was a story he wrote about how he was surprised at how many kids were coming into his college classrooms. And because of the way they'd been instructed, they had a hard time making a judgment call on whether Adolf Hitler was right or wrong in the context of the 1930s and 40s. And it shocked him because they had been indoctrinated into an idea of moral relativism. So what was right for Hitler may not necessarily have been wrong for us, or vice versa. They had a hard time drawing distinctions between right and wrong. So this kind of points me in a direction. Do you see a connection between the change in character education and the change in civics education with some of the social problems we have today?
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of my favorite authors is a guy by the name of Charles Murray. He's written several books over the years. One of them, more recent, is called, the book is called Coming Apart. And so what he does in that book is he talks about the four pillars of virtues that the founding fathers based the country on, those being religion, industriousness, marriage, and honesty. And he says that as the country, the American experience is unraveling, and he actually uses that word, and that's where I actually get the title for my book, The Unraveling, is that as these virtues have unraveled, we see all these problems that are affecting us. And so people are no longer putting a lot of stock in religious faith, Christianity principally, but certainly other religions as well. And as a consequence, as the nanny state has grown up and everybody expects the government to take care of us, industriousness has declined. If we don't have any moral virtues in terms of raising kids, well, one of the principal reasons for getting and staying married is to benefit the children. That goes out the window too. And while we're at it, what's the value in being honest about things? So I'll just lie to get things the way that I see resulting in benefit for myself. And so essentially, all of these things lead to government anti-poverty programs that, in fact, enslave the population to the government. And certainly, a guy by the name of Friedrich von Hayek wrote a book about that. It's called The Road to Serfdom. And now, instead of teaching boys the value of work, we have instead taught boys who end up growing up without a father that it's better to basically reach your hand out and ask for a handout instead of go to work, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and be able to therefore take care of things. And all of that has sort of set up the culture that we now have, where the disciples of Dewey, people like a guy by the name of George Counts, Norman Wolfel, and others in the progressive movement preached Marxism and communism, and that has set up the new generation of the AOCs and those people who are preaching socialism, and therefore we see the battle that's raging on in the culture wars, not only in terms of moral values, but in terms of economic policy as well.
Well, David, I know we've just barely scratched the surface, and we should come back and talk about higher education and how that's affected in terms of character education, civics education. But before we go, tell us a little bit about your book, The Unraveling. We mentioned it, but tell me about some of the content of it and where people can get the book as well.
Okay. Well, essentially, there are three things that I talk about in the book, and in terms of why is America unraveling. And so here's a quick synopsis of the thesis. First is that there was a concentrated effort beginning in the 1920s to remove the moral teachings of Christianity and the principle of economic self-reliance. And then in the 1960s, you had a new generation growing up. Bill Ayers, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and things of that nature that despised Christianity and proclaimed, basically free love and all these other things as the way to personal fulfillment and happiness. Third, then, those types of hippies, if we might call them that, are now in positions of prominence in terms of society, whether it's in academia or government or large businesses, to promote what some have called a new civics. Whereas you and I might talk about the value of learning how government functions, the roles of the three branches of government in terms of how checks and balances work, and certainly the moral values of being a good citizen. This new civics is more about how can you be a good revolutionary working with Antifa, funded by George Soros. And that's one of the things that I also get into in some degree. And so people can find out about my book. It's The Unraveling of We the People. I have a website. It's www.theunraveling.us. You can go there too. But I also have on my website at wisejargon.com, I have information about what I call discovering truth at the movies. Another big thing that I like to do is to look at movies and create a devotional sort of thing. I've done over 150 TV shows and movies over the years, and I've begun to put them into anthologies. I'm even talking to youth group leaders to use those in terms of youth group meetings and discussions about the Bible. So at wisejargon.com, you add a little slash and then at the movies, and then you can find out more about those sorts of things.
Well, it's very important for people to be aware of worldview in movies and worldview in the culture. I had a friend who's was a film student, has made several documentary films and does a lot of film work for my church. He said to me one time he learned in film school that every movie is somebody's sermon. And so we know that when we watch a movie, there's usually a message in it or two, and they don't they edit things. They don't put anything in there by mistake. So it's always good to have your worldview goggles on when you're watching TV during quarantine or whatever. But David, I appreciate you joining us today. Give us that website one more time before we close.
So the book is www.theunraveling.us, and the at the movies is wisejargon.com/@the-movies. There's hyphens between the words at, the, and movies.
Well, thank you, David. Again, this is Micah Clark with American Family Association. I'm interviewing David Lantz, author of The Unraveling of We the People, a book about civics education and how it's changed in America. If you'd like to learn more about AFA, our website is American Family Association of Indiana, AFAIN.net. That's www.afain.net. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Micah.